Hello and welcome to the Practical 365 podcast. I'm Steve Goodman and it is episode 32 of season 2. Hi Paul, how are you?
Hi Steve, I'm good. How are you?
I am absolutely wonderful. But it looks, because we're on video today, that you are not in your usual office. Tell us where you are.
I am not. So I am actually in the Conference and Convention Center in Dusseldorf, Germany for the European Collaboration Summit.
Yeah.
Now, for looking at my background, it might look as though I'm in a Walmart or a Costco or something. But I promise if I pan around the show floor just a bit, you can see there are booths, there are people, there are all the sorts of things that you expect to see at an actual conference because this is a live event. So delighted to be here, even in the midst of everything that's going on. And it looks like, the early indications are that there's a good crowd here. We certainly have a good representation of MVPs. The vendors, all the vendors are here except for one that apparently couldn't get their staff out of Russia. Well, they could get them out of Russia, but they couldn't get them into the EU because they were all vaccinated with the Russian vaccine, which is not approved for use in the EU. So maybe they'll show up later, maybe they won't. I don't know. But, there are attendees here, which is the important part. And, Laurie and Caruana and Jeff Tepper delivered their keynote this morning to a packed house. So we're back to it.
Yes. It does seem like, I think, to anybody listening that all you do at the moment is travel to conferences because you've been to quite a few lately.
It's funny,
not every conference.
All my conference travel got squashed into about 2.5 months. So I had Commsverse, Commsv Next, the South Coast Summit in Southampton, and now European Collaboration Summit. But what's interesting, we talked about this a little bit in the pregame. What's interesting is that's really it for in-person conferences for the next several months. There aren't any large conferences that are currently planned into Q1 of 2022. Of course, Microsoft is not doing any in-person events at least until the end of July. But the community having rushed, that's not the right word. The community having tried to schedule these events in Q4 of this calendar year means now we're down to local user group meetings and regional meetings, but our big national and international events, I think, are going to be done for a few months. So I plan to stay at home and pet the cat.
And so you should. But that's the thing, isn't it? I think if you're organising a conference or an event, then you almost have to sort of strike while the iron is hot, to use certainly a phrase that we use here.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, because you don't know what's going to happen. And I think there's the only one I'm aware of massively is the Scottish Summit, which is coming February next year. And I think that's quite Dynamics focused, but it's got a good spread. And obviously Dynamics with contact center features, the Power Platform, of course, there's a massive crossover. So there'll be loads of Microsoft 365 folks there as well. And I think there's a few speakers coming over theoretically. But that's a lot of, I think there's 200 sessions, 100 a day there. So even then,
I have to ask you about that. Microsoft talks about there being 3 clouds. Yeah. Do you think that it offends Dynamics people when they're referred to as the third cloud?
I think they're used to it by now. I've got colleagues who work in that area. It's a massive space.
It is. It absolutely is.
You can't hope to become an expert in all of these 3 things. It's just you would have to be some sort of uber unicorn to get even scratch the surface, because you've got effectively the equivalent of your marketing platforms, your business CRM systems, your financial systems, your ERP, your whole sort of field service. It's just the dynamic space is absolutely massive. That's why they've got, I guess, 200 sessions over 2 days, which is a lot. If you went to South Coast Summit, there were rooms with very few people in. So, I mean, it keeps everybody safe, doesn't it? That's I suppose the main thing. But as you say, the user groups are back in person, and I run with some Microsoft folks and fellow Practical 365 writer Jason Wynn, Bentley, and a few others, the Microsoft Cloud User Group, which is slightly affiliated to Commsverse as some of the same organisers. and that's back in person in Manchester. And Mike Weaver he'll be travelling on his way as we record right now up to Manchester. So if you're listening to this on Tuesday afternoon and you're somewhere in the north of England, then search that up. I'll put a link in the podcast, mscug.com, and you'll be able to go see Mike today, and he's going to be talking about previews. But you've got sessions coming up tomorrow at the Collab Summit.
I do. I've got a session tomorrow on how the working title, or the final title, is "Email is the Easy Part," but it's about how migrating email in a tenant-to-tenant migration, that's sort of the standard part that we all take for granted. Everybody assumes that anytime you do a tenant-to-tenant migration, the email will just smoothly move over and everything will be great. It's all the other things that are not email that cause problems, and some of those are because of technical limitations in the platform. Some of those are just because of organizational or political concerns. For example, naming standards. You'd be astonished how often people get into passionate fights about what conference rooms or groups will be named in a consolidated tenant. Because when you think about a typical consolidation, one entity may have named all their conference rooms after Marvel superheroes, and another entity will have named their conference rooms after famous scientists, and another one will have them named after the building and floor, as Microsoft does. And so what you end up getting is this battle where each constituency is arguing, no, everybody else has to change their names because my users like the names the way they are. And there's no solution for that. It's purely a political and management and people challenge. So that's what I'll be talking about.
Yeah. So I mean that's very true, because Mike's talking tonight about the preview programs and stuff like that, and there certainly is a perception that it's the easy part, but it's the reason why Mike is in this space is because of having to deal with those challenges of splitting off a shared mailbox, or what do you call the sales mailbox when you've got two when two become one, and the teams aren't combining, and you've only got some data that can go when a company splits off and they're bringing a team over. It's an interesting one, because the ask that I've had before on some of that has been, maybe you can answer this now then, how do you carve out bits of a mailbox, especially if you don't know which bits. We only want to get its utility splitting off, only the customer information that relates to one should be brought across, but it needs to be brought across, and there's 10 years of data. It's an interesting one.
It is. It's a real challenge. And the short answer is going to be, it depends. It depends on what kind of data it is. It depends on how well you can find it using automated tools, because in some cases, you really can do a discovery search to say, grab all these records and put them somewhere else and then remove them. In other cases, especially for really highly unstructured information, the only way you can do it is to have somebody go through message by message by message. And what we know from decades of practice in email migrations, people will never, ever, ever do that. They just won't.
Yeah.
It's the equivalent of you're cleaning out your grandparents' basement, and instead of going through every old newspaper to see if there are any that are historically significant, from the first moon landing or Desmond Tutu being released from jail or what have you, people don't go through the newspapers. They just pick up the whole pile and they take them to the skip and throw them away.
Yeah.
And you'll see the same thing in migrations. If you can automate it, people will do it. If you can't automate it, maybe not so much.
Yeah, and that's often the question, isn't it? Do you need to keep it? If you need to keep it, then the business has got to make a decision there as to who's got to do that, and who's got to file it into folders that can then be moved across. But it's rare that organisations know and have tagged their data so well that it can be easily discovered. Otherwise, things like advanced compliance wouldn't exist, where you've got ML models. People want to get there. But if you've got a migration like that, then is it the time to start to get to know your data? Often, you're just not going to have time to do that at scale. So if you are at ECS, then this is definitely going to be a useful session then, because it is so easy to think, yes, and in many cases, it is easy. in a way, because it's almost the commoditized one. It's the most well-known migration for a tenant migration. There's a lot of good practice there, but there's so many edge cases that come up now. There's been so many M&A over the last year or so that all the complex stuff comes out of the weeds, and the companies that didn't know this was ever going to happen and have been some way down their journey have just had to go halfway through their data transformation and start carving out. Oh, good luck. Good luck.
It's not fun.
And again, if you're listening as you're walking around, you're listening to podcasts, if you're going for a walk, whereabouts in Germany is it? Is it Dusseldorf again, or have I got that wrong?
It's in Dusseldorf, yes. Where I had not previously been.
A stroll in Dusseldorf, listening to the podcast, and you're thinking, I'd like to write for Practical 365. Then come find Paul on the show floor. I think you'll have a bit of a get together for people who are interested in getting in with the Practical 365 writer group, and of course, just contact us if you're not in Dusseldorf as well. We're open to anybody who's interested in writing, as long as you're a good writer, of course, but we'll always try and help you there. Tony, of course, is with you, and he's brilliant at helping people like myself become better writers. That's for sure. So, again, hit him up, take some of his advice. It's always good.
Yes, indeed. Come see us this afternoon.
Yes. On the last one on the conferences and events, so I'm going to promote my user group next week, where I'm going to be chatting. So I'll be talking. I haven't decided actually 100% on the topic yet, though that'll be on the user group website. But it's probably going to be about live events and the technologies like this that we're using now. Paul is actually coming in via hardware into our recording from Teams. And talking about how that works in the same way that the user groups will be live streamed and from Birmingham, that'll be over Teams, but onto platforms like YouTube. So you get to see behind the hood of how that all works as well in my session. Now, moving on. Do you use Microsoft Lists a lot?
I want to, Steve. I like the idea behind it, and I see the value in it. For many of the things that I do, lists are too heavyweight for what I want. There's still so many use cases where either what I need is your sort of traditional to-do list with the ability to track a task and a few pieces of metadata about the task and to assign it or to see its status. Yeah. Or there are things that are more easily done in Excel. And I never thought I would say that, because I'm not an Excel guru, and I don't claim any proficiency with it. But there are just so many use cases where what I really want is to quickly pop open a client and have a matrix of rows and columns that have got some data fields in them that I can then manipulate in some way. So I love the idea behind lists, and I love its power and customization. I just don't use it as much day to day as I thought I would when it was shipped.
Microsoft Lists foundations are SharePoint lists. So there's a bit of a SharePoint contingent. Chris O'Brien, one of our folk, is no doubt you'll see him wandering around. So if you do see him, Paul, say hello. And again, if you order at the conference, say hello to Chris. So the SharePoint dev background where I work means that there's been a lot of SharePoint list-based apps, really amazing stuff built on top of it. But it's been built on top of it. But for me, that means that a lot of the things that I rely on for my job are based on lists. So if I'm working to put together the components of what might be a big program of work, then there's going to be standard pieces for that, and I'll pull those from a list. And that means that I'm actually working maybe in Excel, but I'm working with list data, and I'll go to look at all the information that's been pulled together in a really nice, friendly format in lists. But the problem I've had has always been with those carefully formatted views with formatting that give you coloring and give you images that are brought across, is the speed of it. So if you're scrolling down in hundreds of items, then I've often found that can hang halfway down. You get to C in the list, and it'll be a blank page, and then you'll wait, and wait, and then it fills in the information. So I'm quite excited about it being faster. And I noticed something that landed on my computer the other day, and this was a SharePoint app. Have you seen that on your computer yet? Blink and you'll miss it. I got a notification on Windows 11 that said, SharePoint has been added to your startup apps. I thought, I'm not sure what that is.
So interesting. I just went into my start menu and I don't seem to have it, but
it's not in the. It's a startup background app. So if you search for startup and scroll down, you may have it already. And it's basically, you'd think it was like the OneDrive app, and that was my immediate thought. But it turns out it is the foundation for Project Nucleus, the bit that turns the progressive web app part of Microsoft lists and SharePoint into something very fast and speedy. So unlike OWA, Outlook on the Web, where that has a web-based cache when you use offline mode, this actually instead means that Lists is contacting a local cache running on a SharePoint app on your PC that is a local web server providing that data.
interesting. No, I don't have it, so I'll look forward to seeing that.
I thought it was an interesting concept, and one of those things where that's another vector to investigate exactly what it's doing, what it exposes, even if it is obviously just a local host, how many resources it's using. But it's an interesting approach. It almost feels, like a legacy approach. There was a while back where Zoom had a security issue because they were installing a local web server, and if you trick someone into hitting a particular link, then you could join them to a meeting without them knowing about it. I doubt it's that. I doubt that you hit up localhost port, whichever it's listening on, and you're going to suddenly see all that data, whatever user you're logged in as. But it's one of those things to note. If you see something pop up, it's a valid application. But the performance aspect is going to be a big thing, even if you're not working offline. But the idea that you can work offline with this data, that certainly would have been a useful thing for me while I was traveling a lot, because I'd have a list and I'd cache it locally. So I'd bring it into Excel and keep that refreshed locally to work on.
Right.
I don't do that anymore, but this will mean that those performance issues I won't need to worry about. So that's good. It is. There's also a OneDrive aspect to it as well, but it's for people that don't install the local OneDrive app or don't have the local OneDrive app. So a cache of local files stored that way, and it's a progressive web app. So you open up the OneDrive PWA, and it looks like the OneDrive web app rather than an Explorer view. So that's interesting in itself. To have a look at that. That hasn't landed for me yet, but it'd be nice to see whether does that give you rich previews, for example, of documents and so on, or any extended capabilities that you don't get through the normal standard OneDrive app, like viewing a fluid document, for example.
Right.
Now, moving on, information barriers on the YouTube channel. Patrick made a video about this a while ago in the business context, and Tony Redmond spotted this and blogged about this this week, actually, yesterday, and this had completely passed me by. And this is particularly interesting because if you've worked with education customers, then are you aware of where address book policies come in, Paul? So there's often like a Venn diagram that you'll see when you see students, staff, or pupils and staff, or students and academics, where somewhere in the middle there's a bit of a crossover where teachers or lecturers will be sharing the same information and sharing a GAL with the students, but there'll be a whole back-end admin team, finance teams and so on that have data and information that should never be shared. And in a way, there's a customer relationship with those students where actually much like you can't email an admin person in your bank, you wouldn't be able to do the same, or shouldn't be able to do the same when you're at a university or a college. You shouldn't be able to just pick out somebody. And when they're emailing their colleagues, if there's 5 Joe Blogs, for example, and you're trying to pick the right one, and you don't want to put something in the gal or on the display name that says staff, then that can avoid accidentally sharing the wrong information, or very complex sets of rules. So address book policies are useful for that. But then, as we work in a world where you're sharing out of your OneDrive, or you're storing documents in SharePoint Online, then those barriers aren't quite as effective. And there's some capability in Teams to use your address book policies. This brings information barriers into even the lowest academic plans. So the sort of equivalent, but not quite, to E1 is A1, which is the base plan that most educational institutions will use, especially for students, and it's even in that free SKU. So that's really good and not expected, actually. That is absolutely giving people something for free, which is always a good thing.
It is, and you always have to wonder. Microsoft is not a charity; they don't do things for free unless there's some benefit to them. And I have to imagine that most of their education customers would not have spent money to buy this feature, but that it's valuable enough to them that it helps make the platform sticky and keep people from considering Google as an alternative, given how competitive that market is. Microsoft must not have assumed that people would buy the licenses for that market, or they would be selling those licenses.
You are right. It's a competitive market, and there's a weird perception as well. Like I saw a news article the other day in the Guardian, I think it was, saying about how they need to stop Zoom teaching. But obviously, most of these institutions and educational organisations are using Teams or Google,
right?
Because there's the video part, and then there's the education part, assignments and so on, where it has it's nothing like Viva Learning. You assign people work to do, they hand it in, and then it feeds into the back end learning management systems and so on. So it's so they are. It is competitive, but only with, I think, open source, established players for learning management systems, and Google, because Google have done I think a better job in the US of penetrating that market than the UK and maybe Europe as well. But it's good to see them giving stuff for free, because my concern is that people do need a lot of the advanced security functionality. You do see these organisations moving, especially staff, to the higher plans, because why wouldn't you move your phone system over to Teams and so on if it's at a massive discount? But then the rest of your students, they're going to be on those lower plans, so they'll benefit from features like this in a big way. So that's good, and it also means that something that perhaps was quite niche becomes something that should be much more widely adopted as well, and that's going to help build up expertise, I think, with partners, IT pros, because if you're working in an educational institution, you're thinking of moving on to somewhere else, then you'll have yet another valuable skill before many other people will have implemented it, and that's definitely something worth looking into if it was an ask that you just couldn't fulfill.
Right. And I don't want to spoil Tony's thunder. You've linked to the article in the show notes so people can go read it. Microsoft still has some work to do on these technologies to make them more usable. And maybe having the additional seats or the additional set of users who are going to be using the technology in the education space now will help drive that.
Yes. Yeah. And I know when I've followed people asking questions about stuff that Patrick did, there's questions about how many they can create, how to create them. It's been, it's certainly been one of those areas where it's going to benefit from customers adopting it, providing feedback to Microsoft.
Yes.
Now, I've seen something in Authenticator, and you said you wanted to chat about this. So,
Yes.
what's new in Authenticator after the new icon from last week?
One of the things that I have long wanted is more context about authentication requests. So let me explain what I mean by that. One of the key features that we put into Cognitive Radar and then into Quadratec Nova was the ability for administrators to see on a map geolocated information about where logon or authentication requests are coming from. So, of course, in a lot of cases, it's not perfect because your geolocation by IP data is only as good as your knowledge of where IP addresses are, and it can be fooled by VPNs and so on. But it was still useful because it would show you when there were login authentication attempts coming from places where you didn't have any people. And that was always a useful red flag. So some authentication vendors, noticeably Apple, have done the same thing with their own two-factor systems. So if you try to sign into Apple's cloud environment, then you'll get a context prompt that shows you the geographic location coming from the GPS location of the device, telling you where that login request is coming from. And so if I'm in Dusseldorf and I get an iCloud request asking for a login from, I don't know, Amsterdam, let's say, maybe that's my lost suitcase trying to sign itself back in. That tells me some contextual information about whether that login is likely to be valid and thus whether I should approve it. So Microsoft first introduced this as a preview last month, I think.
Yes.
But they made it super simple to use. Now with a single setting, basically a single click in the tenant, every user in your tenant will now get a little pop-up in the Authenticator app that shows the geographic location of where that auth request is coming from. So that means now you have an additional way to have confidence about whether it's likely to be a valid request or not. Since on a Windows or Mac desktop, you may have processes running that are asking for authentication on local OneDrive where you're not directly interacting with them.
It's worth mentioning that most of that can be avoided by registering the device. So, if you've got a Mac, don't just sign into each app individually, register the device with Azure AD. Same, obviously, with Windows as well, because that's always that's a big area of user feedback where it's not been done properly. You've not used either hybrid Azure AD join, or the device isn't workplace joined or Azure AD registered, and people get loads of more MFA prompts all over the place. And they'll get those almost, you'll get a day where that happens minute by minute. You'll do one and then 10 minutes later another.
Right.
So you can avoid some of that, but it's a persistent issue where it keeps on happening. If you've got a Teams phone, then I was getting notifications from my Teams phone in the middle of the night. It's popping up and wanting to sign in. And when you get sign-ins that are valid, but you don't necessarily, you're almost conditioned to press accept, then you're going to miss some of the things that you perhaps should deny because of that. And if you do see the unusual location and the unusual app, then that's useful. If it says Teams and it's your house, then it's my phone refreshing again. But there's one area where I think even Microsoft folks will probably notice this as well, because I know when I've been to a Microsoft office, for example, it'll always say that I'm in Germany, if you are in an organization, or perhaps you're using a mobile data plan that is not showing the right location, or your geolocation is just wrong. Mine says Warwick and I'm 30 miles away from that. I've certainly got to test it out and see whether for GPS capable devices it takes that into account, and what the user experience is going to be like when you switch it on, because you may need to tell people that as you sign in, if you see yourself sign in and then the location is somewhere else, then remember where that is, because if it says you're Warwick but you're in Nuneaton, you're 30 miles away, then that's where it thinks you are. And that, I think, my car thinks it's somewhere in the middle of Europe as well. So even though it's got GPS, so it's worth being a little cautious with. Test it out a little bit first, see what the experience is like, before just popping it on and then dealing with those user requests where they deny it and say, well, I'm not here, I'm not in London. And it turns out that this is because you've used Zscaler or something like that, and something's not passed through the IP in quite the correct way as it's proxied a request.
It'll be interesting to see to what extent users gain confidence in the feature. I think it'll surprise people at first when they see these contexts, this locational context pop up.
Yeah.
But I think pretty quickly people will learn to suss out the difference between a request where the location is wrong, but it's a valid request, as your example of your device saying you're in work and you're not, versus a request that's not valid. So we'll see.
Yes. And there's a couple more features in that. Now, one is a registration campaign. Now, there's always that chicken and egg situation. Things like security defaults, when if you're in a tenant with that, they prompt you over time to register. They give you a bit of a lead up to it. But it's that there's two things that people struggle with, which is number one, being in the right place on the right device to be able to scan a QR code. And on the last podcast, I talked about how you can register from the device. So you can install Authenticator, sign in, and then you're ready for MFA. But the other part of that is encouraging people to do that. And this is quite sensibly the ability to have a registration campaign. So you can encourage people to register in advance of launching MFA. And whilst, as you've said before, just switch on MFA, the worry often is, and it's dispelled almost always when you do it, if you've set up the prereqs right, that everybody's going to have a problem. And that is, I've seen customers who were adamant about trying to avoid that in almost every scenario. And this would have helped them a lot to be able to have that campaign up front before they switched it on, to just get over that hump of, I don't know whether people will register. Am I going to have a lot of users that become locked out? Combine that with comms, base comms from Microsoft to use to publicize this as well. So that's out there too. So good stuff.
It is.
Now, moving on to the roadmap and message center. One thing you mentioned was compliance records for tasks.
Yeah, so right now, when you create a new planner task, it goes into the planner task storage bucket. The details that, those are important for what we're talking about here. Back in May, Microsoft said that they were going to start creating compliance records for the user's mailbox when a task is assigned to the user. And the idea there is that they wanted to put planner tasks on par with other things that already get stored as compliance records in the mailbox. So the Teams chats, various other kinds of metadata around Exchange. And then nothing happened. This month, there's a message center notification that says that Microsoft are actually rolling this out. But I haven't seen it in their tenant yet. That, of course, doesn't mean anything, just because of the way Microsoft rolls things. It can take weeks and weeks. But they promised that this will be done for all commercial and government tenants by the end of January. And so what that means in practice is that when you create a new task and assign it to a person after this fix or after this change hits your tenant, then if you inspect their mailbox, you'll see it as a hidden compliance record copying the metadata of that task. The way Planner refers to it is as a secondary copy of the task. So the primary copy is still in Planner storage, and that means that it's visible to Graph, it's visible in Planner, you can report, and you do all the things that you do with Planner with these tasks. Whereas the compliance copies are just Steve's copy or Paul's copy of the task that now will be visible in discovery searches and so on. So welcome improvement. I'm glad they finally shipped it. I just don't know exactly where it is in my tenants. And maybe some of our listeners will see it before I do.
So one to investigate, but it's on the way then. One thing that I've seen people quite excited about, and I must admit I have to bookmark this page because I can never remember how to get there if I want to leave a tenant. Now, you'll be able to do this directly from the Teams client itself, which is pretty good, and hide those tenants that you don't necessarily want to see as well.
Yes.
Which I'm quite pleased about, and that's going to give you a some ellipses, I think, next to the tenant. So then you've got, as well as muting notifications for that tenant from the list, then you can hide it completely and leave the Azure AD direct from the Teams client. So I would imagine that there will be some people doing a bit of a clean out. I know I might, even though I'm not in tons of tenants at the moment. And on SharePoint news, we've got something which doesn't sound massive, but is actually potentially something that, once it's delivered, could be something that is either absolutely magic or something that you don't end up using a lot. Really, it's one of those things where I think it sounds great in theory. It's going to depend on how it works in practice. And one challenge that organizations that use SharePoint 2010 or 2013 on premises have got is the upcoming the upcoming support end date for using workflows in those products, and also wanting to move those to as they move to SharePoint Online, and moving those to something modern like Power Automate, and of course building things like that from scratch, even if it's to act upon the same data, is still complex and requires a lot of testing. And what this feature is going to do is allow you to migrate out of the box workflows and from 2010 and SharePoint 2013 designer built workflows to Power Automate directly. So you'll be able to use PowerShell to do that, which is great. They'll get a UI in the end, and we're looking at tentatively June next year for that. Now, when I first saw the roadmap item, it said March. Now it said June the next day. So either that was a mistake, or this is something that, like many things, there's always different priorities, could move back. So don't bet on it, or plan your hopes and dreams of a smooth migration around it until you've got your hands on it. But that's something that I expect there'll be a lot more about as it's coming up. Maybe next Ignite, if there's a spring one, we'll get a big demo of what it's going to be. Maybe it'll come into preview if we're lucky, for a mid-year launch, and that will be a big thing for many SharePoint people. And the last one that I got that I wanted to mention is something that I've been asked several times. This is often an ask from education customers, but also people that are planning on moving from Stream to OneDrive and SharePoint for their video storage, and that's to be able to block downloads of video and audio. So the scenario that a school came and asked me about was they using Stream. There was functionality to record those meetings, and then Microsoft changed that so it would only be stored temporarily in Azure. You could download it if you wanted to and upload it to SharePoint. Then obviously the functionality to have it in OneDrive and SharePoint came, but the challenge was they didn't want pupils downloading the video and then keeping that video of the teacher doing the lesson. They just wanted them to be able to watch it while they're in the tenant itself. So that is going to be arriving next month, which is going to be good. Prevent download. So that's quite a useful one if that's something that has been stopping you from planning that move from Stream to SharePoint and OneDrive. And I think that's all we've got time for today.
It is. Not that much happening in news. It's the end of the year with the is in the U.S. and the rest of the world impacting what Microsoft does. Everybody's busy finishing up calendar 21. So I don't think we're going to see a lot more news out of Microsoft, but you never know. They may surprise us at the last minute.
Yes, they may well do. So don't forget to make sure that you subscribe over at your favourite podcast app or over on practical365.com. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for more practical news.